Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick Allen. Who is Antifa? In the last few days, we've heard a lot about this organization. Now, south of the border in the United States and even here in Canada, there have been protests all over the place in major cities. Initially, these protests were triggered by the tragic and terrible death of George Floyd in Minnesota. However, these riots have now been, these protests, which were initially peaceful, have been hijacked and turned into ridiculous, violent looting riots. Many sources are suggesting that this has been fueled and spawned by an organization called Antifa. But who exactly is Antifa? Are they really anti-fascist, as their name suggests? Or are they actually promoting what they suggest that they're against, fascism and definitely communism? United States President Donald Trump recently declared that he was going to seek to list Antifa as a terrorist organization. Is that even possible? And should Canada be doing the same? Is Antifa really a threat? Well, joining me now is Tom Quiggin, who's a court expert on terrorism with over 30 years experience in the intelligence community. He's written and co-authored 2 books on national security and terrorism. He is currently the primary contributor to the Quiggin Report, which is a podcast that looks at issues of national security and free speech. Tom, I'm really grateful to have you here as an expert. Thank you for joining me.
Good morning, Tanya, and thanks for inviting me to Counterpoint.
Excellent. So who exactly is Antifa? Is it an actual group, or are we talking simply about an ideology and a very loosely affiliated group of persons? What should we be concerned with here?
Yeah, it's not an actual organization in the classic sense of the term. It's more a loose affiliation of a series of groups that share a common broad-based ideology, and that ideology happens to be very left-wing. It is described by itself as being anti-fascist, but what it really is at the end of the day is something that is more pro-anarchist syndicalist, or pro-communist, depending on the different people that belong to this loosely knit organization. One of the things that does bind them together, however, that sort of identifies them as a group, is their belief in direct action. And direct action, of course, is a polite word for violence. So a number of groups, terrorist groups and extremist groups over the years have tried to protest. They've tried to get reaction from government. They have a hard time doing it. So they decide that violence is the message they want to portray in order to get greater attention. So Antifa, whatever you want to call it, has a very strong history of violence in America, growing a little bit in Canada, not quite so much. And it's worth mentioning at this point, a lot of people who call themselves terrorism experts, in fact, never study the history of terrorism or the rich tapestry of terrorism. But people tend to forget that in the United States, most terrorism over the years, especially since World War II, has been leftist in orientation. So a real quick example of this that people tend to forget was that in 1971 and 1972, in one 18-month period, there were 2,500 bombings in America, almost all of them by the people who we would now call the intellectual grandfathers of what we now call Antifa.
Wow. When you and I were doing research for the show, you mentioned this, and I hadn't been aware of such bombings. I was born in the 80s, so it's a different generation. That being said, it's amazing that there isn't very much written about this, or that we're not taught about this history. And I found that quite disturbing, that these far left roots in America, that we haven't learned about these bombings and how perhaps that might be shaping our conscience right now.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's very little attention paid to that in history and in even courses taught on terrorism. I think one of the reasons is even back in the 70s, there was sort of a liberal slant to the media. And remembering this was taking place in the context of the Vietnam War. So it tended to get sort of swept under the carpet. People didn't want to talk about it. Also, the 70s in a certain way were kind of a really bad time period anyway. The 60s were all about joy, love, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The 70s were all about violence and protests and some really bad clothing and some really horrible haircuts. So there was that sort of tendency to just take everything about the 70s and sweep it under the table. But having said that, that violence was there. It was real. It was right across America. And that tradition of direct action violence in the leftist stream of America was there then and it remains now.
Now, in America and in Canada, because we have seen riots taking place, for example, in Montreal, there has been some protests in Toronto, which for the most part were peaceful, but Montreal, they did turn violent in the last few days. I've seen the Twitter feeds. I've seen, this Antifa US Twitter group, which has now been removed from Twitter for violating community standards, whatever the heck that phrase ever actually really means. And I've seen the calls to violence. We're coming to your neighborhood, go to the suburbs. There have been allegations at these US riots that pallets of bricks have just miraculously or coincidentally just shown up in advance of these riots that, they're there and available for those wanting to throw them. This seems very coordinated. And that to me is a hallmark of terrorism. It's a very coordinated, premeditated event. So I appreciate that, yes, it is an ideology, but I'm starting to think that maybe this is more actually of a coordinated effort, and whatever Antifa is or who claim to represent, that they really are trying to coordinate this violence.
Yeah, is the violence coordinated? Is there a common theme and a common stream to it? The answer is yes. If you ask a different question, do they have a headquarters? Do they have a chain of command? Do they have a leader? Do they have that sort of thing? Then the answer, of course, is no. But of course, you don't need a tightly knit command and control group in order to coordinate a certain amount of violent action over a large area such as America. It's also worth noting that Antifa has for several years now been granted, I don't want to say a license, but for instance, the mayor of Seattle has constantly refused to crack down on their violence. They'll take over a street, they'll beat people up, they'll smash windows, and the police are told not to interfere because they're expressing their political beliefs. So you've got a whole series of political leaders at the municipal and state level who are not only empathetic, but in fact sympathetic, and in fact take action to support them. For instance, the worst of the violence right now is in the state of Minnesota, and it's worth noting that the Attorney General of Minnesota is a guy by the name of Keith Ellison. He's an Islamist. He is openly in favor of supporting groups like Care USA, the Muslim American Society, which have both been listed as terrorist groups in the Middle East. And he has openly come out in support of Antifa on a number of occasions. And now his son has come out in favor of this sort of thing while these riots are occurring on the street. Also, the daughter of the mayor of New York, de Blasio, his daughter is openly supportive of Antifa, and he said he's proud of her activities. So what you've sort of got on one hand is a loosely knit group of individuals who've got a common theme. And of course, they've got social media now to communicate with, which is a wonderful tool for organizing these kinds of things. And they perceive themselves as having a license from a number of very senior political figures, mayors, attorney generals, those kinds of people who are openly supporting them.
So it sounds like there's a double standard, that those who peacefully protest, especially during the time of Corona, I found this the most hypocritical. During the time of COVID, if you're peacefully protesting, I know there have been people who wanted, their civil liberties restored or open this up or open the economy up. And there's been huge crackdown on them in terms of slamming them for not social distancing and whatnot. And then you get these riots, which keep aside the violence, the looting, the destruction of property, the destruction of human life, because people have died. Police officers have been shot. Innocent civilians and business owners have been killed. Keep that aside for a moment. But, where are these social distancing mandates now? Where is the crackdown on why aren't you wearing a mask and whatnot? So keep that aside for a moment. But you mentioned that, there's an attorney general, mayors, relatives of mayors, whatnot, are supportive of Antifa and all their activities. So is it actually possible then, if Donald Trump said that he wants to declare them a terrorist organization, is that actually possible for him to do so? And what would that mean for America?
It would be a very difficult route for him to go. If he was to declare a group of foreigners operating in America a terrorist group, he can get away with that quite easily. The law is set up for and allows for that sort of thing. But for him or any other president to declare a group of American citizens a terrorist organization or a terrorist entity, the law doesn't actually allow for that. So it's a bit difficult. What he could do, and I think the direction they're going to move, is they can identify it as a sort of problem group, a group of people who are committing acts of terrorism extremism or acts of violence. If he actually wants to follow through on this and actually strengthen the hand of the authorities, they could do a lot of things, like, for instance, federal funding for state and municipal police forces could be channeled towards intelligence organizations within those police forces, and they could be told to focus more on domestic terrorism, i.e. Antifa and like-minded groups. Also, as much as Antifa doesn't have actual leaders, there is no nominal leader. I've done intelligence work on a number of riots, a number of demonstrations, G8, G7, G20, all those sorts of things, the Montreal riots back in 2010, 11, 2012, and all that sort of stuff. And of course, what you get is you get the usual suspects, shall we say. It's almost always the same small, narrow group of people who are involved in the actual violence. And of course, they're a very tiny minority. So if the federal government of the United States wants to step in, one of the things they could be looking at is cross-state border activity. So if someone leaves the state of Minnesota to go to the state of New York to participate in a riot or a violent act, that then becomes a federal crime, and that becomes the jurisdiction of the FBI. So if the president wants to see greater activity against Antifa, there's a number of paths he can take, but declaring them a terrorist group, it's going to be a bit hard. The other thing people tend to forget is when you declare an entity a terrorist group, the real weapon is not that you can call them a terrorist or you can charge them with terrorism crimes, because you can already do that. The real weapon of these laws where you just declare somebody to be a terrorist entity is money. In other words, you can go after their physical property. If they own a building, if they have computers, you can go after bank accounts, you can go after money flows. Transferring money from one part of the group to the other part of the group becomes a crime unto itself. So that's the real power. With Antifa, you don't see that kind of thing because they're just not organized that way.
Yeah, it makes it definitely not just a moving target, but you're right. It's hard to pin down if it's just a group collected around an ideology, which I should mention. I mean, they're very adamantly pro-communist. I mean, in my research, I've actually seen Antifa, and when I was in Europe for a conference just a year ago, I remember Antifa came to picket this, very relaxed conference on the family, and it was aggressive. And this is before masks became normal in society. I mean, people wearing black with masks, they're physically threatening, let alone with the bats and the placards. And the pro-communism is just something that, as a daughter of an immigrant who escaped communism, it really disturbs me to see such a push for communism in North America.
Yeah, their history, such as they would describe it, and such as probably really exists, they take their name and their inspiration from the anti-fascist groups of the 1930s and 1940s. And those were folks who were actually opposing fascism, anti-Mussolini, anti-Hitler, that sort of thing. And most of those folks were described as either anarchists, communists, or a term that you don't hear very often, but they're called anarcho-syndicalists. In other words, they are individuals who believed in a certain anarchist kind of ideology, but wanted to combine that with worker organization, i.e. unions. So most of the anti-fascist groups in Italy and Germany, the ones that survived until they were basically exterminated, had their roots in anarcho-syndicalism. So when you see Antifa now in Europe and when you see them in America, that's the sort of tradition that they hold up, that they sort of say they aspire to. In reality, I mean, they are not really, they don't have the moral strength, I think, that the old anti-fascists used to have, because they're not anti-fascist in as much as they are pro-communist and pro-revolutionary.
Right, well said. So in Canada, to put this in context of where we live, should we expect to see Prime Minister Justin Trudeau take the same route that Donald Trump, the US president, did in moving to declare them a terrorist organization? Would that help here in Canada? I mean, because they do exist. I've seen them around, or people at least carrying placards that say Antifa. But how would that impact Canada? And is this something that you foresee happening?
I don't see it happening as long as Trudeau is prime minister. His globalist ideology, his so-called progressive ideology, which in real world is kind of a cultural Marxist kind of ideology, is rather closely aligned with some of these folks. So I would regard it as highly unlikely he'll take any action against them unless they, come out and actually start killing people or something like that. You may remember that Trudeau had said he was going to list the Iranian Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist entity. There was a motion in Parliament. Trudeau himself, much to everybody's surprise, voted for it, along with a number of leading Liberals. And that was 2 years ago, as of June 12th coming up, and he's done nothing on it so far. So I would say highly unlikely go after these groups because ideologically he's rather closely aligned with a few of them. Just a quick thought here. Like I said, I've done intelligence work on a number of riots and, protests, the G8, G20, anti-Bush, anti-Iraq war, those sorts of things. Speaking in very broad terms, I'd say about 90% of the people that show up for these events are citizens. They've got a point of view. They're angry with the government. They're pro-abortion. They're anti-abortion. They're pro-free trade. They're anti-free trade. They're pro-capitalist. They're anti-capitalist. They are whatever they are. And they want to yell and scream at the government, which is actually a good thing. That blows off a bit of steam. And if you have an intelligent government, which we don't right now, but if you have an intelligent government, the government will pay attention to these to see where the pressure points are in society. There's probably another 5% of people that show up at these things and they think they're something special. They wear black hoods and they yell, smash the state, and they throw bricks through the window of Starbucks. And they say, look at us, we're anarchists, we're going to smash the state. In reality, literally, most of these people live in their mother's basement. And I'm not using that as a pejorative statement. In fact, they live in their parents' house in the basement because they can't do anything else. They have to borrow their mother's car if they want to go to a protest, this kind of thing. They're just noisy people who think they're tough. They're not an actual threat to the state. They are a threat to Starbucks or to, whoever the target of the day is. But behind all of this, there's that 1 or 2 or 3% that does show up. They are actual anarchists in the sense of the term. They could hold an intelligent discussion on political organization. They actually want to smash the state, and they're willing to take action and put time, money, and blood into it. These are the folks with the actual problem. And of course, they actually believe very much here as well in direct action. In other words, they genuinely believe if they go to these protests, if they can inspire the crowd to turn violent, if they can provoke a violent incident, they believe that will cause the masses to uprise and support them all the more. So they actually want to set things on fire. They want to use Molotov cocktails. They want to injure people because they think once the violence starts in what they call the sacred space of the riot, then that will build political momentum for them. It doesn't normally work. It's pretty hard to mobilize a mass with a couple of individual acts of violence. But nonetheless, Antifa and a bunch of others genuinely believe that their tiny minority of people using violence can inspire a much larger mass movement against the state or whatever the target of the day happens to be.
Well, listen, Tom, thank you so much for joining me today. Your expertise is very welcome, and I hope to speak to you further down the road on these issues. Hopefully these riots will stop. I mean, I don't think you can ever quell one's thirst for anarchy. However, I hope things don't escalate into more Canadian cities, and hopefully they'll calm down in Montreal, that's for certain. I have exercised my freedom of expression. I think freedom of assembly and freedom to protest is an amazing thing. And I think that's a hallmark of democracy. And when we see ideologically Marxist groups hijack those rights and kind of pervert them and to push an ideology, I mean, while it's their right to protest, of course, but once it turns violence and there's not just inciting of violence. I hate using that phrase because what does that actually mean? But an actual violent action, like here's a skid of bricks, I'm going to throw this through your store window and to hell with you. It's terrible, terrible. So I'm hoping the coming weeks we'll see things really calm down and quickly. And who knows, maybe Antifa, maybe Trudeau will surprise us and go after Antifa here in Canada. Who knows?
Yeah.
But anyways.
Just as a closing thought here, we are in the middle of an economic crisis at the moment. The bars are closed, the restaurants are closed, the hotels closed, the airlines have basically ceased to function. You can see that. That's a real world thing. What we're not seeing right now is the financial crisis that's going on behind the scenes. Credit markets are drying up. Derivative markets may explode. We've got this nonstop quantitative easing. We have long-term low interest rates. There's a whole series of problems below the surface. What people don't realize is what you're seeing right now, the breakdown in the economy, is merely the start of the problem. The economy is going to get much worse as we move ahead towards the summer and the fall. When people see that the government is going to hit the wall, late this fall, early next year, the money runs out and we actually have to cut spending and there's no more free billions for everybody. My strong belief is social unrest in Canada and America and Europe is going to become a much hotter topic as we move along.
It sounds like it'll be broader than just Antifa here in Canada and in the USA.
Yes.
Well, listen, thanks again, Tom, for joining me. You've been very insightful. Once again, this is Tanya Granick Allen. Thanks for joining Counterpoint.